So topic-wise, I use Bridge with Photoshop, and you'll see why I do that. We'll look at perspective correction, stretch and warp, which is Trevor's favourite. Just some visual direction. So when we're looking at, after we've done our perspective correction and our stretch and warp, just the basic visual direction, looking at light color contrast and the way that we can impact the image and where our eye goes. For Terry, at the end, we will look at blending images and blending modes to come up with those straight out of camera shots that Trevor loves. So in Camera Raw, I tend to do not too much. By default, it goes to Adobe Color, and I usually choose landscape because landscape is a little bit more colorful. You'll probably see the blues popped a little bit there when I turned on Adobe Landscape. So landscape is just a little bit more saturated with the color. So being someone who likes color and also working in the landscape sphere, that is a selection I choose. And the only other thing I will do is in light. So let's compare, all right? I can click auto. So if I click auto, usually it does that. So Adobe runs the algorithm and says, I want to brighten all the darks, I want to do everything else. But if I want to be a little bit more selective and creative in the edit, I don't want the thing as bright and as burnt out as what it's just given me. I want to be a little bit more selective in the process. I want to take control of it. So I don't do auto. I just play with these sliders independently. So if I click auto, you can see what Photoshop has done. Increased exposure by 2 stops, contrast by 5, minus 13 highlights, plus 15 shadows. So it's decided that's what a properly exposed image is going to be, and that's what it gives me. But I'm going to do it manually. The 2 things that I usually do are shadows. I just lift the shadows a little bit so that the shadows aren't too contrasty. And usually if there's a burnt out section, I will drop the highlights a little bit, and I can choose at this stage just to brighten it just a touch. That's about all I'm going to do, just so I've got all the information there. It's reasonably clear. I can then be a little bit more selective in the things that I'm going to do to it. We're running Photoshop on manual, not auto. All right, so it's the same approach. So I click open. Well, the other thing I do is optics. All right, so we come down to optics, because there is some lens distortion depending on the lenses you use. I usually tick the remove chromatic aberrations, which are the little pink or green or blue halos you get around some images at times, especially when you're shooting into the bright light, and a profile correction. So depending on your camera, it usually knows all of them. What are the nice things about the shot? So it's quite nice how the light washes across the facade. We've got the brights of the clouds down in the bottom left, and we've got the blue of the sky in the top right. That's a nice feature. The sheen on the polished stainless steel crisscrosses, that's kind of cool. So we're going to do a perspective correction. I can do it on the base layer if I want to, but just in case I stuff up, I do the Control-J and duplicate the layer. And I come up to Edit, Perspective Warp. You'll see that the mouse crosshair has changed. Tell it to then use those 4 points to straighten up vertical, straighten up horizontal. All right, so you'll see the difference. So if I pick the corner of that window and I click and hold and I drag it, it drags out this little box, right? And I can choose what I then drag that out to. So for the purpose of this exercise, I'll put the other corner in that corner. Then I come up and when you release it, leaves the box. And you can see here that the mouse changes, the crosshair changes, and I get this little pin, so I can click and hold that corner. And I drag that one up into there. I'll do the same on the other corner. I can click and hold and drag that one down to that corner. That's what I'm telling Photoshop I want to be corrected. Up in the top, you'll see that the menu has changed a little bit. So I have layout, warp, I've got up and down lines, I've got horizontal lines, I've got the grid, that's the undo, that's the forget about it, that's the thank you very much. All right, so I choose warp and it highlights what I've selected. If I just wanted to do the verticals, I could click that one or align the verticals on its own. If I just wanted to do the horizontals, I could do that. So in the process of doing the 2 of those, it's actually done both. Reverse that. So if I go and say I want everything, I want verticals and horizontals, I click on that guy, warps the whole thing, squares it up. Having got that far, what do I do with it? Options I've got available to me for warping and stretching. So just in case I want to come back to this, Control J, I'll copy that. But if I do a Control A, which selects everything, Control C, which cuts everything, and a Control or Command T, I get my points around here, which I can click and drag. And if I hold Shift to constrain X and Y, I can stretch this up to where I would like it to be. So maybe it's cool to go through the spandrel. I'm kind of matching the top and the bottom, and then the same on the left and right. So maybe I want to go halfway through a window panel and I want to get rid of this guy on the left, so I'll stretch it right out. Now, this is a case of you do the adjustments first and then figure out your composition later. All right, because it's not until you've done your stretching and your moving that you know what you've actually got to play with. So in this instance, I would then probably come along and crop, choose the crop tool, the facade of the Arthur Phillip Tower. So maybe I end up with something like that. So one of the go-to things I do for playing with the light is I go to levels. Right? And the reason I go to levels is, which you'll see here, I get the histogram. And on the histogram, that little dot is black. And you can see this is a graphic representation of the histogram. So the histogram sits mainly between black and midtone, and white is all the way off the page here. So one of the things you can do for brightening the image, rather than using exposure or brightness or whatever, you just visually match and you tell Photoshop, I want white, which is the value is there, and I want to match the value of white to what is the brightest part of the image. So I drag that slider down to the beginning of the first bit of white that appears. So you can see what that has done to the image. It's a much more subtle brightening than happened in Camera Raw. And I've got control of that, all right? So if it's a bit too bright, I can ease it off a bit, or I can make it brighter. So then on the midtones, you'll see if I slide that, what happens. If I slide the midtones to the right, it darkens the midtones. If I slide it to the left, it washes them out. So essentially that's contrast, isn't it? So I can actually change contrast, because now I've set my black point and my white point. If I change midtones, that's changing the contrast. So I can play around with what might be a nice lighting effect. And when I'm editing, I choose not to do it globally. I'll just be looking at bits of the image. So I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute, and we'll finish playing with the black. So there again, if I want to crunch up the black, if I crunch up the black, that then gives me my contrast, doesn't it? If on the first go, I maybe do something like that. If I turn that on and off, you can see the difference that just playing in levels can do to the image. The changes that have happened there are all global, all right? But as with all good editing, you've got to look at what bit it does well when you do the adjustment and you apply it to that part of the image, because it doesn't always do it well to the whole image, all right? So for instance, I quite like what it's done to the brights down in the bottom left, but up here it's all a bit flat and ho-hum, all right? So I might want to do a little bit more aggressively on the top, a little bit less on the bottom. So let's undo that for a minute and we will do things selectively. But in the first instance, we'll break it into the three components. So let's just look at the image and what it does well with. I quite like what it's doing there. I can click on the mask and go Control or Command I. That turns off that adjustment, all right? And then I can selectively brush it in. Okay, so then I'm going to do some adjustment to that by using my mask. So I'm going to choose a brush. I always choose hardness 0 unless I'm doing something specific. And I usually have an opacity of 30 and a flow of 50. That's my go-to settings, because it's nice and gentle, nice and soft, the adjustments. And it's better to lay up 5 adjustments softly and subtly than one big heavy one. And you can see that just by doing it to that part of the image, I'm accentuating the sense of the light moving across the image. If I've made a mistake, I come across here, change it to black, brush out some of the adjustment. One of the things about light is it's directional, and it's kind of good when you edit to reflect that. With that adjustment I did, rather than freehand brushing it in, click on a spot with the adjustment, and then I move my brush to another spot and hold Shift, and then click again. I'll actually draw in a line between those 2 points, the adjustment. So if you're trying to get the sense of light as a beam washing across something, instead of doing it freehand, you can actually get a perfect little line that runs across the page. And to emphasize that, I've got my brush at a certain size. If I use my square crosshairs, I can reduce the size of that. So on my second pass, I'll do a more concentrated one. I'll click on there, hold down Shift, go to my point. So then I'm starting to feather the effect of the light. All right, so I've got a broad one first, a skinny one in the middle. So now I'm getting a sense of that beam of light on the facade, and then I'll do another one as the third one. So you can see now the advantages of doing a soft brush, 30, 50 and 0, because you can actually layer these up as they go and you don't see the transition. So the last one, I'll click on that, hold Shift, move it to my point, click. So now I've not only used the adjustment with the brightness, but I've got it more as a beam, haven't I? And all I've done is just brighten a little bit of the image and then lay it in selectively. Currently with the image as it was, the light was coming down from the bottom left and bleeding up, but I want to get my eye more to the middle of the image. So I've actually chosen to change where the light is coming from, but I'm still making use of the glow at the bottom and the darkness at the top. It's just that I've redirected the visual. I'm pushing the eye further up into the middle of the image, having a little bit more control of where it's going, what it's doing. So we've done the brights. Let's have a go at the darks. So I will use the same control. I'll go levels, and then I'm going to play with the darks here and see what. So I'm not looking at what I've just done with the brights. I'm just looking at the other areas of the image and seeing by dragging that in, the shadows are now kind of crisp. And I can also, if it's too dark, I can just lighten up a little bit of the midtones. Or I've got my mask. I'll invert that. B for brush. Use my square crosshairs. And I would just brush a little bit of that into the shadows. Now I'm getting a crisper, more even shadow. If I turn that on and off, you can see the difference between it being a bit foggy, being now nice and crisp and sharp. So as a little facade study, that's where we started. Perspective correction, bit of a crop, got my light, fix my shadows. So a full transformation, but I'm using all the information I captured. I'm just manipulating it, presenting it in a different manner, but all the actual bits and pixels, I haven't added pixels, taken pixels away. I've just brightened and darkened the pixels that are there. When I'm editing, so let's stamp all these up. So often you need all the information in one. I can mask by color. I go to the yin yang on the side symbol down here, and I go to channel mixer, pops up with this little menu here, and what it does, it's got the picture in red, green, and blue. But if I click on the little Japanese flag here, I've then got a little bit of a different menu where I can select and mask. I can choose by color range. I can invert. So if I click the color range one, it comes up with this little tool. I've got a dropper plus, and a dropper minus. So if I use the dropper and I say that color there, I want all of those. I can change the fuzziness of my selection. Fuzziness is how close to the color that I selected. So the less fuzzy, the less tolerance. And range is how far away from where it is that I selected. So you can see I'm getting to a point where I can just get those mullions. So if I use the plus dropper, I can come and pick the mullions. So just as let's just take that. So what that has done is it's created me a mask. So if I click OK, I've got a mask in this layer. What I could do is I could choose a brightness and contrast layer, and then I can take that mask and drag it into my brightness and contrast layer. I can click brighten and darken. I'm just brightening and darkening based on that mask I selected. So one of the ways that you can uncontaminate is if I go to image adjustments, match color, pops up with this little menu here. And I've got a little box I can tick, which is neutralize. And neutralize is essentially, you tell me what white is and I'll adjust everything to that white point. So if I click neutralize, you can see immediately it gets rid of the blue and chooses that colorway based on what it thinks white is. And with fade, I can actually choose to accept all of it or a bit of it. So at 100% fade, I'm not accepting any of the neutralize. At 50%, which is often where I will leave it, I get some of the fade, but still keep some of the blue tinge because I quite like it. There again, it's a tool that you might use selectively and not just accept exactly what it's got. it's kind of done a nice job because it's brought the pinks out in the granite and it's made the blues a little bit bluer and got rid of some of the cyan contamination that's from the reflection, the sky reflections. Now let's take that one. Let's see what that does for us. Brightness and contrast, drag that into here, place the mask, go to brightness and contrast. Let's zoom out a little bit. That's quite a nice effect, isn't it? Because it's actually running with some of the glow that we've already given it. So it's enhancing the so before or after. So adding that extra little bit of gloss sort of gives the image a little bit more three-dimension, doesn't it? What else do we need to do? It's looking a little flat. So one of the things I often will do when I've been working on an image is I like working on the grey background because it's nice and neutral and dark and you can actually see what you're working on. But what I do before I finish is I put a white border around it and then I can see whether the image is flat, needs some lifting, or just how it's sitting. If I go to image canvas size, currently the image is 297 millimeters square. So what I can do is actually increase the size of the canvas and make the increase of the size white. Image canvas size, let's double it. Let's go 60 and 60. All right, so having put the white border on it, I can then edit based on the white border. So usually I go and revisit levels because levels is a great place to do this. If I go back into levels, you can see now my adjusted histogram of where I'm going. All this stuff on the edge here is the white border, all right? But the first white point on the image is still back here. So often at this stage, I'll then do that and drag it in to pop the brightness of it, to pop the white back to the white where it is. Sometimes the black is shy and you might want to crunch the black up a little bit. If I hadn't done the border, I wouldn't have known to brighten it like that. It's not only the light that looks flat, it's the color that looks flat. We can choose the hue and saturation. And with hue and saturation, I've got my little color picker here. I click on it, I get my little eyedropper and I can choose a color. And if I click with my eyedropper on the color, I come up with this hand with the arrows left and right. If I click and hold and drag to the left, it desaturates. If I click and drag to the right, it saturates. All right, so I've actually got a control there where I can control saturation using the color picker. Or globally, I can choose to change the image to make it, maybe there's a little bit of green in the glass, maybe a bit mauvey, so this changes the color of the whole image. So if you want to start playing around with the facade, you've also got the ability. You can see I've got the word master. I can break it into the colors. So I can say, well, I only want to change the blues. So I choose the blues. I can then choose just the blues because the facade's not changing, is it? It's just the glass because it's the blue and I can change just the glass. And if I want to change the facade, there's probably some reds, I would think. Let's see there where we're changing what the facade is. So currently we're editing this in RGB, red, green, blue. And I can change where I edit it. If I go up to image and mode, you can see image is currently in RGB. And I've got the options of CMYK, lab color, multi-channel. So I could actually change the color space that this image sits in. As a buy, you need to be 16-bit. So if your image, when you come in and says that it's 8-bit, you just click on 16-bit and it changes the image to 16-bit. So you need 16-bit. We're going to choose lab color. And lab color does lightness, A channel, B channel. And what A channel is, you will see in a minute, it balances two colors and B channel balances two colors. So it's a different way of controlling the color. If we go to a levels adjustment, you can see in the levels adjustment, we've got our histogram, but now this is different. We've actually got lightness, A channel, B channel. So if I select A channel, and what's going to happen is this balances purple and green. So if I drag this slider in, I increase the purple. If I drag this slider in, I balance it with the green. So I can do the adjustment in the color with the purple and the blue and the green. All right, so if I want to bring out the pink in the facade, I might do something like that. And then I can swap over to the B channel. And here it balances yellow with blue. Having done the adjustment, I got to freeze that before I take it back into RGB, because if I take it back into RGB, you just lose all of that. And to do that is just stamping it up. So Control Alt Shift D, you create a layer with all those changes in it. I then go back up to image mode RGB, put it back into RGB. And because it's in a layer, I can add a layer mask. So if I turn it off, I can then choose to apply it selectively, or I can take all of it. So what I might choose to do is, if I invert the mask, I might just brush the color in to the bit where the light is to emphasize the light. Your eye is drawn by light color contrast. So what we've done is we've increased the light part of the image, so that'll draw our eye to the brightest part. I can then reinforce that brightness with color. If I turn that on and off, it'll be very subtle, but you can see where the color is now stronger where I've increased the brightness. So I'm reinforcing the edit that I've done with color, but also introduced a subtlety to that process by adding that little bit. What was a little bit flat and grey now just has a little pop of color where that light band runs through.
I like the square.
Inside the square? Squares are great for whenever you're dealing with geometry. Because as soon as you put something in a square, people get the clue that it's all about pattern, shape. So what are the three basic ones? The square, the circle, and the triangle, isn't it? Just how all those interact and what you're doing. So, so taking the square, putting a circle inside the square, that's a great way to order the graphic, isn't it? And then putting the bit that you want of interest inside the circle. This
one also has triangles. So
yeah, that's right. And then this one, the movement from the bottom left, taking it through the image, but using the grid of the sort of screen that was there, using that as the layout, and then putting the stuff in behind it, but directing the eye with it.
The globes of colour are good there too.
Yeah.
Drawing your eye into the doorway.
Into the middle, but adding the people certainly just adds that Deliveroo driver. The poor bloke in black working on the weekend, ordered his Deliveroo for lunch. So that's got me the AMP building, the old AMP building. So whilst that is active and I've got the marching ants, if I select a brightness and contrast layer, it'll actually put that selection in the mask. So if I'm not actually going to use the brightness and contrast adjustment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the mask and drag it into the levels mask. So if I turn that on and off, you can see it's actually darkened just the AMP building at the back. All right? So that I think is good, because then your eye at the moment I think is kind of sitting here in the image. Darkening off the old AMP, it now tends to sit more in the circle, right? Just brings your eye down a little bit. You can do the same sort of thing with color. I've got the mask, I've got the hue and saturation adjustment, I've got my color picker. I can come across here, I can desaturate without having to go to the trouble of cutting him out. You can see the impact of desaturating the building on where the eye is drawn. We can choose by color. So then if we want to be a bit more selective, we can come along with our channel mixer, Japanese flag, color range, and I can choose the yellow and add to the yellow. Oh, got a little bit of yellow in the background, have we? I change the fuzziness. It just changes which yellow. Right? You'd probably spend a bit more time and do all this a little bit more accurately, but that gives us a mask. So I can do a couple of things. So I can do brightness and contrast. I can brighten the yellow, darken the yellow. The other thing we can then do is we can do a hue and saturation layer. And in the hue and saturation layer, down here, I clip it to the mask that I got below. So the hue and saturation adjustment will only apply to the mask. And if I want to, like Grant has done, I can change the color of the, so the selective masking, as you can see, is pretty cool, because then you can then apply stuff as you go. So the selection by color is usually pretty good with most things you're wanting to do. So I go to the channel mixer again, my Japanese flag, my color range. This time we're going to choose color of the glass. And the fuzziness on that we might increase, so we've got a little bit more. So then we do the plus adjustments with brightness. So I can choose to brighten all the glass, darken all the glass. Right? So you can muck around with what the glass is doing. But then I can also add my color at the same time. So I do hue and saturation, flip it to the layer below, and then I can actually change the color of the glass. Right? So I can add a green color, I can add more blue to it. I can increase the saturation of the glass to punch it out a bit, maybe somewhere there. What I'm going to do is replace the sky. So this is all rough and ready. We've got a few overlaps, so we should, if I wanted to spend my time, I'd push a few of these marching ants back just to tidy up the... All right, so for the moment, we'll just put that hold it in a brightness and contrast mask. So for sky replacements, for instance, I've got a whole, you can see here, I've got sky plus storm, blue skies, night skies. If we wanted to change this sky gradients, all right? So I've got some skies that I've shot previously. Here are my gradients, my standard gradients. So for instance, what I could do is I could drag my gradient onto this, and then I've got the mask I created here. I drag the mask up onto my picture. Then I can manicure it. So that's one way to adjust it. So I've got a gradient and I've got a mask. How do I mask the mask? There's a fantastic little thing down here, which is a group. So if I create a new group, I can drag that inside the group and I can put a mask on the group. That's the trick, right? I can turn that on and off. And if I wanted to just put that in as a gradient, and if I just want to drag that in gently on the bottom and not too much of it, I could just do it softly. Just a little flush of pink or something. So I don't have to be as aggressive as the whole thing.
Yeah.
I can just bring a little bit of it in, nice and softly, just so it doesn't look too over the top. Right? That's a way that you can mask the mask. Or the other way that we could have done it. With this, I can change opacity. So if I click on the opacity slider, I can do it that way. I can reduce the opacity of the sky, so that's looking a little bit more natural. I can also, if I want to change the color of that again, even though I've got my basic gradient, well, let's try color balance. I clip it to the mask below. If I want to bring more red into the sky, I crank up the red. Or if I want to balance that with a little bit more green, or if I want to make it more yellow. So I can actually play around. So the gradient just gives you the change of color, and then you can muck around with the hue and the color of the actual gradient using a color balance tool as well. But that's certainly, so if I compare that to the beginning, brings in a subtlety and softness to the image by actually putting the sky in, doesn't it? Edit, transform, warp. Right, so difference with the warp tool is you've got 2 points either side rather than one in the middle, which you get with the general one. But also you can move stuff actually within the image. So for instance, if I didn't want this little curvy bit, I can actually drag the image down like this and adjust it to suit. Just fine tuning the composition. Warp is fantastic. Select everything, Control A, cut it all, Control C. And if we're going to transform it, we go Control T. So this is back to the standard grid. So as you may or may not know, you can hold Control, and then if you pick a corner, you can drag it in the XY coordinates by picking the corner. So there again, we can do something. Maybe you want to do that there, and you want to just drag this across and tweak this. So down the bottom here, we might then be forced to drag it all down like that, which means we don't get the subtlety of the takeoff and everything. You might do something like that. Or we go to the dark side, and which I love to do because I think it's a fantastic tool. Get my little selective tool and we run around this guy. And I right click and I go generative fill. see what it does. All right, so this is using the AI generative fill, but using it for patching. And it's so much better than the clone tool or the other replacement tool, which tends to mush stuff up. Let's see if it proves me right. Look at that.
Hey, that looks good. Yeah.
All right.
Hmm.
It is a very smart and clever tool.
That's a
And
reference it up a bit, yeah.
And I think the FCC is going to have to come to grips with being able to use it for repairs and maintenance. That great mesh of grid, if you think about how they had to put it in there, it all came in parts and they had to bolt it together. And how do you hide all the bolts? So this is how they did. So they drill a hole through it and then put a cap on it and put the bolt inside. So if you want to get rid of all of those, you can go around and tidy those up. Even this stuff, if you wanted to get rid of this, you could get rid of these and tidy it up. But you can see what the let's compare the two approaches here. So look what the replacement tool has come up with. Right. So if I go undo the spot healing and let's give our computer machine learned friend a go instead, and let's see what come up with if we do a generative fill. A better job, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. See if it can separate all three things here. So usually if you do a little pinch point there, it can separate those out. And then I right click on that, generative fill. Oh, we missed a little join there, but we were thinking about. There you go. Look at that for tidy. Now, does that give us some inspiration? Let's give it a go.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can get rid of this.
Yes.
Pretty good.
So what's worked pretty well is that the blue of the sky is now kind of blending in with the blue of the glass, because that's kind of what you want with the reflection. You want the same sort of toning rather than this being green and that being off. And then I think the subtlety of the gradient is probably working a little bit better, and then cranking up the yellow. So if we go all the way back to the start, we can compare that to that. What happens if we do some perspective correction on it? We've got edit, perspective warp. And so if I pick that corner there, drag it down to maybe there for that corner. Drag that guy to that corner. Guy to that corner. See what happens with squaring the building up if it changes the way that it presents. Right, so first step I could do is I could just say, well, I only want it just to be vertical. All right, so that's changing it to be just vertical, or I want both. So if you are competing at a camera club and not just doing it for your own purposes, and you weren't allowed to use generative fill, you could come along here and you could color pick the grey, B for brush, get myself a bigger brush, and paint the grey in. All right, that's acceptable, but doing the other one isn't. All right. So there's ways around the rules, Terry.
Yep.
but if we go back to the dark side again, we can actually patch the rest of this facade here. I think you'll find generative fill will do a reasonable good job at that. Let's see what it does. It's done a pretty good job, and the last little bit just to tidy it up a bit here is we might just put in the rest of the sky there, and we'll generative fill that. And then we're going to do a stretch after that just to fill the rest of the page, or just depends what, if you like the sort of 8x10 format, it kind of, the 8x10 is a little bit more generous. It makes it feel like it's a bit more vertical. Selectively choose all that with my marquee tool. I can right click. I can go layer via copy. So it creates a layer of my selection. And if I go Control T, that's just applying to the layer now. And I go to the middle, I hold down Shift, I can drag all this down. So what it does is it accentuates the vertical
Yeah.
nature of the building.
Mm.
So, so that now is exactly the same image, but it's a bit more stylized, isn't it? Match color, neutralize. So that now I've got a little bit more pink in the sky, which gives me a little bit more choice in how it does the selection. Channel mixer and see if we can select just the sky. Color range. Yeah, so getting the ability now to select maybe just the sky. I can change the fuzziness a bit. So there we got maybe something like that. Well, let's just see what that does for us. So if I go into brightness and contrast, drag that mask in there. Did that go? It didn't go. Let's go again. Brightness and contrast. So then if I just brighten or darken the sky, so darkening really highlights the glow of the building, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Right, so you might just a little bit pixelated. So maybe you want, if the reflections of the story, then maybe darkening the sky. That helps, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So that's an option. Well, the other option would be sky replacement thing, wouldn't it? Edit sky replacement. There again, if you're going to compete these images, you've got to put your own skies in because the sky replacement comes with some skies. And it's easy enough to add a sky. I'll show you if you've never tried. So that's one sky it's added. We don't like that one. Let's try a gradient one. You can, because it's on a layer, you can brush it out too. But so in here, these are a whole lot of skies that I've taken and put in. So to add a sky, it's as simple as pressing the plus. Right? So if you hit a plus, it then asks you to go and find a sky. All right, so, and it will then add the sky to the library. After having a think about it, that's the one we added. So if I click on it, it swaps over the sky to the one that we put in. All right. So you could do something like that. So it hasn't done a great job at the edges, but let's just play with that for a minute. So at the moment, you need to click on the background to get past that. So the first part is the sky. So if we click back here, I've got some choices that I can do with my sky. So I can change the brightness of the sky. I can change the color temperature of the sky. I can warm it up a bit. I can fade the edges. Edge lighting is kind of cool. If I turn that off, you can see that's without, that's with. Color adjustment is the foreground to the background. So what I can do is I can put the blue of the background sky into the foreground, or I can turn it off. I can choose how much I want to do that. And there again with foreground lighting, I can make the foreground darker or I can brighten it. And what happens when it does it, these are all the changes that it did. So this is the sky replacement, a layer mask on the sky replacement. If I do Command I can turn it off, all right? So just like we did before, if I just want a little bit of texture in the sky, I can come along, choose a gradient. I want a white brush because I've got a black background. And if I just drag the sky in, I can get just a little bit of detail into the sky. All right, just enough to give it some interest rather than being plain mauve. The edges around the building are going to be okay now because I haven't dragged too much of it on. And then if you want to make it a bit darker, you can have another go and drag that a little bit more. And having done that, if I wanted to tidy that up again, there's my layer mask. I can click on my layer mask, come up here with a brush, and because of the white reveals, black conceals, where it's run over the building, if I choose a black brush, I can brush it off the building if I want. Right, so I then come along and I just touch this up and tidy up where the sky has been brushed onto the building. I do it a little bit more accurately than that, but you get the idea. And that way I can tidy up any rough edges. So up on these little bits here, you zoom right in, get yourself a smaller brush, minus on the arrows, and you come along and you tidy up the bits on the mullions. Just so you get that the highlight flash happening on the top of the mullions there, just to tidy that up. And then, so that way you get just a little bit of detail on the sky, which I think probably adds to it. What do you reckon?
Yeah.
Being plain grey, so you either go for the, Jeffrey Smart, very simple, whatever, or you add a little bit of detail, because what that does with the detail is it just brings the eye up to the top of the page again, doesn't it? It offsets and balances the bright, that bit of brightness we've got down there. Your eye then gets drawn up because you've got a little bit more detail to look at and highlights the top of the building. All right, well, let's have a look. So out of interest, one of the questions is, which helps you configure it, is what's the story? So is it a dialogue? So you need the sun and the glow on the building, and that's the story, or is the glow on the building the story? And it's a bit like when you look at the the old Dutch masters. If you look at any of those paintings, you don't see the light source. All right, so you see what the light is doing, but you don't actually see the light source. So, for instance, the candle light is hidden behind one of the figures, or the light that's coming in from the window. You see the light coming in, but you don't always see the window. And it's just a question of how much a distraction is the light source. All right, so let's have a look at that on its own and just see, do a compare and contrast and see what that does. What happens when I take the light source out of the picture? It's quite different, isn't it? Because your eye is more interested in what the light is doing on the facade. But as soon as the light source is there, I've got two things happening in the picture, haven't I? I've got a dialogue. My eye bounces between the two. And this way, it's a simpler, more direct image, in that it's all about the reflection. Right? So immediately the story is different, but also where your eye goes is different. Because if you want my eye to rest on this stuff, it keeps on popping back and forwards to the light source, right? Because what you're doing, so the story of the light hitting the building and interacting with the building, that's one thing. This is the other story, which is just about the light and what it's doing on the building. So that's a basic first choice, but also understanding the impact. So what's really interesting is that if you go to the rock platform and take your photos of your sunrise, the number of people who always have the sun in the photo. But if you move your camera just off and away from the light source itself and look at what the light is doing washing along the coastline, much more interesting, much more subtle image. But we're a bit like moths to a flame, where we love to see the light source. Yep. So that then gives you two ways of processing it, doesn't it? One with that discussion, or one with just that. All right, so maybe we can not only have the light on the lower part of the building, you might have a wash of light up there too. All right, so maybe we go brightness and contrast here. Just lift up the top, or we could darken the top. All right, so you've got a choice there as to whether we darken the building against the sky or darken the sky. So let's go and brighten the building a touch. And to tidy up that edge, we get the brush with a black zoom in, Control plus. B for brush. We got arrows, and we'll just tidy up that junction between the two. And we've also got to fix up a little bit where I didn't mask it too well. So we need to just tidy up that one, tidy up that. Sky got picked up, so I changed the color back to black and we brush that guy back in. Just tidy up the edge of the mask. All right. That might be the first little subtlety. We're just bringing a little flash onto the top of the building, just sort of like the second tier of reflection. Do a rough mask. And I can put that in a brightness and contrast layer. I just happen to have a nice sky up here, sky and storm, maybe one of these nice stormy skies. Maybe drop this guy in.
Hey, Tim,
Yep.
with that gradient tool, that's something I don't know how to use.
Yep.
Each time you're putting those lines in, did they replace the one before, or are they like?
It builds on the previous one.
Okay.
Right. So if you look at the little mask there, it's got a light grey.
Yep.
Just there. If I then, so what you got to do is see how the pointer changes. So see how it's an arrow with the 4 points there. That's actually selecting. So that means I can actually grab this gradient and move the direction of the gradient.
Yep.
Here I can also change the smoothness of the gradient and where the transition happens. And then once I move off that, if it becomes the little plus symbol,
Yep.
if I click and drag again, that then builds another one on top of the previous one.
Okay.
So my blue sky, if I don't want the blue, I can just desaturate it. All right. So you can do it that way. The other, into a levels adjustment, you can see here with our histogram, the white's a long way off. So if we want to brighten the image, we can drag our white point in, but we may not apply it to everything. So just having a look at in here, it's actually doing some nice things to the reflections in here. And I might say, well, yeah, that's quite nice. And if you look at the coincidence, it's actually the peak in the histogram there. So you might slide that to the peak to have the most effect at that particular point of the histogram. And you can wind the contrast in by winding the blacks or the midtones down a bit. But I'm just looking at the back face of the building there and what it's doing there. That does a nice job on that. So then I come to my levels and I invert that, turn it off, B for brush. Now if I use the directional brush again, as we did before, so if we click in a spot, hold shift, then go again, you get more of a directional glow on it. And if I go X, that turns it from black to white. So with some of that, I might brush some of that over brush off up in the sky there and just leave the nice sheen across the back of that building there. All right. So if you're, so what that does, I'm just looking at managing the eye and the image. Before I've got the bright spot here, so that's where my eye goes. I've added a little bit of detail up here to bring the eye up and supplement that. And then with this flash, my eye's now coming down here. So it's kind of doing this in the image now. So rather than just being on this, I'm now enticing it up to a subtle change here and then the brightness back there. And then that way it's sort of traveling around the image a little bit more. All right. So if I compare the two of those, having done that brightness, you could actually even subtly lift the transition of the brightness of this guy, right, just to make it a bigger hit zone for the eye to look at before and after. So I'm just drawing the eye into the other parts of the images which have got some potential. So if you think about selling the story, this really dark plain sky, I haven't got a reason for the light to come from the sky. And by adding the little subtlety in the sky it then gives me the plausibility that, yeah, there is a break in some of that cloud for that light to actually come onto the facade. So I've got a reason for that to happen. And I think in this circumstance, that flash of blue you've got in there, we probably don't need. So I'll probably desaturate him a bit. So I come with this little picker. There's two blend modes which are really useful. So here we're in normal blend mode. So I've got the choice of screen blend mode, which brightens. I can put a layer mask on it. I can invert it, and I can use B for brush, and I can use the brightening that happens in screen mode rather than using, right, and it tends to be a slightly softer brightening. All right, so you can see there where I've just a very subtle soft brightening, but what it does is it uses the image by using the blend mode. It uses the tonal changes in the actual image to then do the brightening and darkening a little bit softer. So as a comparison, the other one is a darkening mode. I stamp it all up. And as a blend mode, if you go to, you got to multiply, that's a darkening mode. Let's make it all dark like that. Put a mask on it, and we'll brush in the changes that we did before. All right, so maybe up here, I've got the light coming from the top corner, and I use my shift, press it down, run it across, and I do a couple of flashes of light from this top corner to accentuate the idea of the light washing over the building. Right, so that's where we started. Added a flash of light just to brighten the shadows, and then you can actually darken the whole image and then brush the light back in. But if you compare where we started to, there's a lot more contrast in the image. So right at the beginning there, you can see that the details in the shadows are quite soft and just getting a little bit more crunch out of the facade. You got it lovely here where you've brightened it, but in the shadows it's maybe a little bit soft. This then has enabled the shadows to also be crunchy as well as having the bright section. So in my library files, I've got a whole lot of textures that I have created over time. You can see here in the textures, I've got some grungy peeling paint. I've got some light. I've got some other grungy peeling paint. I've got the walls of the side of a ice cave in Iceland. I've got some sand. So I've got some sand textures. I've got some salt lake textures. Some of them have interesting impacts when you overlay and blend them. So let's, for instance, so we'll get rid of this guy. When you drag on a library symbol, it gets put on a separate layer each time. So it's as simple as just dragging it off again. And these blending modes, which we had where we played with light and multiply, you can see as I scroll over those, I'm getting different things happening depending on which blending mode I choose. Pretty interesting ones, and you just play with them. So look at that. We've got some lightning happening there. Look at that divide. Because it is on its own layer, I can put a layer mask on it. I can go Command-I, or Control-I, turn it off, get my gradient tool, drag some lightning bolts on from the bottom subtly.
Excuse me, Tim.
Yep.
Can I just ask, why was it blue? Like, why did the sand texture become blue?
If I invert the image, which just turns the color back to front, Control-I, that's what it does. And most of the interesting ones, what they do is they do a combination of inverting the color way before they apply it. So say we like the pin light. My composition now needs to be different because what it's done to different areas. For instance, I would go Control-Shift-E. I then might come up and I'll do my edit, transform, warp, which is going to do. So the box isn't affected interestingly, is it? So it needs to go. And this part of the image down here needs to go. So my composition, it's kind of an exploratory process to see what the blending mode does to it. This one here is an in-camera movement shot I took of some lights, maybe a half-second exposure, played around with moving the camera, I've created this texture with the lights. And then if I play with the blending modes, if I come down here, I then start getting some interesting stuff happening. Difference is always a really crunchy one. Hard mix, pin light, linear light, vivid, and you can choose which ones you want. So because it's a layer, I can choose the opacity of how much of it I see. I can softly blend it in. I can also change the brightness of it. So if I do a brightness and contrast adjustment and I clip it to just the texture layer, I can brighten and darken the impact of the texture. I've darkened the texture, but in here, I can also brighten the background. So if I do a brightness and contrast layer, clip it to just the background, I can brighten and darken the background. So I can work the two together. So I can work the background and the overlay so they're kind of balanced. Hue and saturation adjustment clipped to that, and I can play around with the colors of what I've put on. All right, so if I'm trying to balance the colors, maybe a green and red together maybe works better. Often the blues and the golds. With the finished version, once I've got it to there, so we stamp all that up. If I then come across to lab color, I can crank up the pink. Let's just select the two of those. Brush that back. Choose that color. All right, there we go. I'll put that in this layer. B for brush. Watch this though. If I change the blending mode to darken, this one's a cool little in-camera movement thing I did again. If I change the blend mode to difference, because the texture is on a separate layer, I can then muck around with the texture now it's on the image. So if I select the layer with the texture, if I go to Edit, Transform, Warp, I can now stretch and move the texture around to the places where it has the best impact. All right, so I can fine tune. So for instance, if I don't want the texture over the tip of the building, I can then start moving the texture around with or without impact on the tip.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe at the top here, I want this to transition straight off the building. And I want it to sort of blend in with this here. And I want the aurora patterns happening in the background here on the outside. And then maybe I don't like the confusion of where it is on the curve. I want to see all the curve. I can move that around and then fine tune where these things are sitting. This is an inversion of the original color. All right. So with the background layer, what I can then do is I can put on a hue and saturation adjustment. If I clip it to the background layer, I can then go and change the colors of what I've just done, and then change and muck around with where I want the colors to be. But on top of that, say I like what the orange is doing there. It's got a layer mask on it, hasn't it? So I can invert the layer mask. I can brush in that color change of the orange just to that section of the facade if I like what it's doing there. So if you're doing the color mapping of just seeing where the eye goes and what colors, you can then go and change the colors by another mask that you put on, just choosing the colors. And there again, I can change the saturation of what I've done, desaturated, change the brightness. So it's a full, you just work your way and see which impact has the best effect in the best area of the image. And so you can see here, just by changing lightness in the hue and saturation, that you're getting all sorts of different effects, and you can play with those and where they are and what they're doing in the image. I kind of like it just here. So I'm going to do the big circle and forget about the rest of it, because it's all about the circle and the pattern and what's happening here. So that becomes my final image here. So for brightening and darkening, I can just do a brightness and contrast layer, and I can pick this up, and so if I still want to maintain a bit of a vignette on it, I can invert it, leave a brush, just bring the eye into the center of the image. Something like that, maybe. I think it was Leslie. We were chatting yesterday about treating photography a bit like a painter might go in sketching. So you go out and you photograph stuff, and then you bring it back to the studio and you use it. All right. So textures is one of them, isn't it? So you might go out and you might have a ICM day. This one is a combination, and Rick might recognize this because the background is actually the Museum of Australia, the background pattern, and then the light with the ICM is this, and I've used the whole thing as a texture, right? Not only just the lights, but also the thing underneath. So this is the classic shot of the cathedral at Siena. But the time I was there was the time of the Palio. One of the things with the Palio, all the various sections of town, which are called contrada, the contrada go and do a procession around town with all the flags of their local area and their horse rider. So they take their horse and their horse rider, and they all process around town, and all the guys who are taking part, they all process. So there's half a dozen of these different contrada going around. And when you're walking downtown, it ends up being like this, right? So here's Robin in the midst of these guys, great throng of people wandering around town, waving their flags, following the horse and the rider, ready for the big horse race in the square in Siena. All right. To say I want to capture some of the mood, but I also want to mark it as Siena. I might use the other picture, which has got the flags in it, which is a bit like this. And I overlay my flags onto my picture of the cathedral. And now I'm layering up the experience of not only just the architecture that I saw, but the experience that I had with the flags. So I changed my blending mode. So then I then start exploring other ways where I've overlaid the image of the place with the experience I had, and I can blend the two into an image, twisting and distorting and playing around with where it sits and how it sits. And poor Trevor sitting there.
I'm going to wake up now.
I'm just into taking photographs, thanks.
The question is why?
Because I can. It's the same with any creative endeavor. So photography is it's a scientific instrument. It's calibrated, it's unforgiving. And so the whole idea is to, well, the first step is you come to grips with your camera, all right, and what it does, how it does it. And then rather than that being an end in itself, which is what straight out of camera photography is, at some point you come to the realization that it doesn't matter how much of that you do, and it doesn't matter how expensive your camera is, it's not as good as your eye. It's not as good as what you see and perceive. It's a clipped view of reality anyway. So you've selected a lens, you've selected a particular shot, you've played with settings, and to try to say that straight out of camera is pure and exactly how the world is delusional, because it's not. Because every single photographer, you take your picture, you look at the screen, you say, that's not exactly what I saw. Purely, it's a tool of capture. And then, so it's a matter of what you do with the capture, because, is a long exposure straight out of camera, is that reality? You never see the water moving like that, do you? But straight out of camera, the fact that you can freeze water droplets at, at 1/3000th of a second, fantastic. But is that reality? Is that straight out of camera? So once you start playing with your camera and you take the restrictions off and you treat it a bit like a painter does, which I think is the best analogy, is that all it is capturing stuff which you then choose how to interpret and how to use. So rather than a paintbrush, it's a much more accurate way of capturing stuff. You get all the detail, you get all the fine bits of the image. You don't have to sit there drawing leaves, because the camera captures all the leaves, but how you put it together, interpreting the landscape before you in your own way. If you've been playing with this other stuff in the background, when you're actually looking, it teaches you to look, all right? Because the way that you then look at the world before you then becomes different as well. And then that gives you a bit of a clue, and it gives you that edge because it improves your perception of what's before you. So much we take for granted wandering down the street. So yesterday we had the effect by just taking our time and looking at stuff. The world was a different place. A cyclical process where you play, you become more aware, you look at opportunities, you then go out. When you're then looking, you're looking differently, and it's a really it's a freeing up experience. Thanks for coming along. I enjoyed wandering around with you all,
Thank you.
and enjoy playing.
Playing.
Well, it is playing. It's big kids play time, all right?
That's right.
And that's what we all need. We got all burdened and weighed down by reality all the time. So why not have a bit of a play? Lose yourself. That's a Barbara Blades. That's a Rick America. That's and it'll be identifiable because it's got a certain style. It's got a feel to it. It's got a way of looking. And that's what you're learning. And it gives you an opportunity to express that. So